Hi folks, my name is Reverend SHAWN VERHEY. I'm the managing chaplain at HMP YOY Thorn Cross Young Offender and Adult Prison. And I don't know about you, but I think the world really needs some hope today. And if you're either involved with the prison service as a governor, as a chaplain, or member of the public, you would really want to see people's lives transformed. And as a managing chaplain, I'm always looking for new ways to engage our people with that amazing restorative justice gospel of Christ. It will turn around the life, not just the mind, but the heart, a complete change, a paradigm shift, as it were. And so rarely I'll come across individuals who have actually been inside. They've been there, they've seen that, they've got the t-shirt, and God has completely transformed their lives. And one such person is this amazing friend of mine called Mark Bowden. And Mark's going to be telling you about his book, 10 Times as Bad. We've had Mark to Thorn Cross, but really my first meeting with Mark was about 25 years or so ago at Weimar Prison. But prayed with Mark and prayed God's calling over Mark and laid hands on Mark. And the things that Lord has done through Mark Bowden's life is just amazing. It's miraculous. It's transformational. It'll change your life. And if you will allow Mark into your life, into your prison, your church, I know he'll change yours as well. So please, can I introduce to you my very dear friend, my brother in Christ, the amazing Mr. Mark Bowden. Hi, Mark.
Sean, thank you for the introduction.
God
Most kind of
you.
you. So, as Sean said, we're here to show you this book. It's 10 Times as Bad. Now, this book isn't written because I'm 10 times worse than anyone else, but I'll get to that in a minute. So, my name is Mark Bowden, as we've already heard, and it was in the year 1998 when I was sent to prison for 5 years. What happened basically was I was charged with attempted murder, and I took a lesser plea for a Section 18 malicious wounding and received 5 years in prison. Now, in the run-up to that prison sentence, I'd been in prison a few times before. What can I say? My life was anything but ordinary. You know, when I was a kid, I always had a sense and a belief that there was something more to life, you know, something bigger, something like there was a purpose for me, like there was something that I knew was there, but I couldn't really touch it or sense it or see it. And somehow, and I don't know why, because nobody ever told me this, but somehow I related that feeling that I had deep inside me to God. I thought to myself, you know, Mark, one day you're going to find out what it is that you're here for. So, anyway, as I say, my life was anything but ordinary. My mum and dad, they were damaged people. My mum was abused quite badly when she was a child, and she'd sought escape from the family home when she was about 15 or 16. She'd started to drink quite early on, and my dad had also done the same thing. Now, his background was entirely different, but these two people had met up and they decided to form a family. So they fell in love with each other, they started to drink, and onwards we go. So now, if you imagine now, you've got two people who are both trying to flee from their own internal pain by getting drunk all of the time, and they're trying to raise a family. You see, what happens is, unfortunately, in the normal way of things, is a family is meant to be the priority. But for people in pain and damaged and addicts, what happens is the addiction becomes the priority. So my mum and dad, unfortunately, they took alcohol and cigarettes over everything. And what that meant is it meant that there wasn't much left for us kids. You know, so me and my sisters, what we used to do is we used to have to go around begging on the estate for food. That sort of thing. You know, my mum would sort of like send me out with a shopping list. You know, if you go to number 12 for the bread, or you go to number 14 for the milk, and if you go to number 16, you can ask them if they've got a few ciggies for your mum. You know, that sort of thing. And I've got to tell you, it was pretty embarrassing. The neighbourhood kids, they used to make jokes about me, sing songs about me, all that sort of stuff. And it was just not a very enjoyable lifestyle at all. Now, what also used to happen is because my mum was also deeply, deeply wounded psychologically, what she used to do was she used to keep me off school on purpose. And she'd say to me, Mark, you're not going in school today. You need to stay at home and help your mum. Now, what that really meant was you just need to be around the house while she recovers from, you know, the night before, drinking heavily. And I was usually the outlet for her anger, aggression, whatever, you know. So I got quite frustrated about this because whenever I used to return to school, the teachers, they used to, you could call it punishment, but what they used to keep me behind after school and give me extra work to do and kind of like a detention. And I felt that I was being punished for something that was entirely outside of my control. So you've got me walking around an estate and being punished by the neighbourhood kids and having songs sung about me, that sort of bullying. You've got me in the house being bullied by my mother, who was very aggressive, alcoholic. And you've got me going into school and being bullied by the teachers for all things that were outside of my control. Now, I didn't know necessarily that I wasn't to blame. You see, because what you do is eventually if you hear something enough times, you start to believe it. So I started to believe that I was a bad kid. But inside I felt like I was a good kid. I felt like I was a sensitive kid. Like I wanted to do something with my life. You know, I believed in nobility and the knights and all of that sort of stuff. And you know, even the police force. Now, you know, don't get me wrong, that wouldn't have fit in very well at all with my background. But I like that sort of thing. You know, the fight for justice and nobility and all that sort of stuff. And I tried to be a good kid. I used to try to help old people with the shopping and all that sort of stuff. And I would say I was a deeply sensitive little boy. Now, okay, but you've heard about me being bullied. And eventually, as I started to grow in size, and I'd been studying martial arts, one day, some guys, they started to have a pop at me. And I jumped up and I scissor kicked one guy and he went down. And I thought to myself, you know what? That's it. And I snapped and I said, no more of this for me. So I started to go down a path that was really uncomfortable for me. And I started to become somebody that I would say that I wasn't. And inside, I didn't want to be the person that I was becoming. I started to get involved in more and more fights. And as I did so, like, I started to fall in with a group of guys that were really into sort of like going out and committing burglaries and all that sort of stuff. Now, these were also a group of guys that had been sort of targeted because of their poverty, but they decided that they weren't going to accept that. So what they did is they started going out and burgling shops of a night time. So I went along with some of these fellas and I started to burgle shops and I started to take the stolen goods into school every now and again. And I'd use school as a marketplace. I'd start to go in and use it as a place to sell the stolen goods. So I think I was about 14 years old, maybe 15 years old, and a young man asked me if I could get him some speed. Now, I'd not really had much to do with drugs at the time, but I had a lot to do with drink, you see. I used to drink quite a lot and, you know, just dabble with acid and that sort of stuff. But this guy asked me if I could get him some speed, so I knew somebody that could get hold of speed. So I went to the person and I said to him, I said, look, can you get me a gram of speed for this guy who's asked me for the speed? So the person that I asked for the speed said to me, well, okay, I'll get you the speed. Tell the guy it costs £5 extra, and when you get the speed, I'll cut it in half with bicarbonate of soda. You'll make double your money off, and you'll have another gram left to sell to somebody else. So I thought to myself, well, this is better than climbing through shop windows at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I started to do that more and more as a regular thing for me. I started to commit, you know, like the shop burglaries and all that sort of stuff. I started to do that less and less. And I had an uncle who was basically a full-time drug dealer. And what he did is he said to me, he says, well, okay, Mark, he says, look, if this is what you're going to be doing, why don't I lay you on an amount of drugs, and at the end of the week you come back to me and you give me the money and you make your little bit of profit. So that's what I did. So I started selling drugs as a you could say full-time sort of occupation. I mean, I wasn't doing anything at school. I dropped out of school. You know, I pretty much just gave up on it. Parents didn't ask any questions. They weren't really interested. They were doing their own thing, and it seemed appealing to me that I could basically just go out and just do whatever I wanted to do. So I didn't like it at home, I'd already said that, and what I did was by doing the drug dealing side of things, I found an escape. I found an escape from home. So I'm quite young, and I'm starting to get wrapped up in this drug scene. It was the early 90s, you know, into the late 80s, into the early 90s, the dance scene had started to kick off, and it was kind of cool to be involved in the drug scene, especially as a drug dealer, you know, in the dance scene. We're talking ecstasy and acid and all that sort of stuff. So I started to get wrapped up in that, and I did think it was cool because I suddenly found acceptance. You see, people wanted to be around me as Mark the drug dealer. Now, I'm not talking like I wasn't a gangster or like that, you know, I wasn't anything major. I mean, I was just a kid just trying to sort of find some answers and find some sense of belonging. What I did was I got involved a little bit heavier, and a little bit heavier, and a little bit heavier. I was listening to lots of gangster music and that sort of thing. And I was filling my head with all of this violence and all that sort of stuff. And I started to associate the violent link between, you know, all of the gangster rap and all that sort of stuff and the drug dealing scene. And I started to reach a conclusion that, well, what I would do was I would build a reputation up for myself. Now, bear in mind, having been bullied myself, I never wanted to be bullied again. And so what I did was I started to fight lots more. There was lots of gang violence. There was lots of, you know, group fights, you know, involving hammers and axes and all sorts of things. You know, I've got a big scar on my head where I got hit in the top of the head with a sword. And by the time I was 18 years old, I was already carrying a sawn-off shotgun. It was just a little pistol grip 410 bolt action shotgun, but you know, it would do some damage. And I would say that pretty much I had a reputation as a guy that you didn't mess with. Okay, so here I am now, Mark the drug dealer, so to speak, you know. And I didn't feel happy. I felt miserable. I looked at the guys that were buying drugs off me. They seemed more happy than I did. You see, so what happened was I started to use a little bit of something. I started to smoke a bit of weed. I started to take a bit of speed, and I was, I'd say I was a little bit happier. Then one day, what was happening? I was coming down off this this night of partying, this night of using amphetamines and E's and that sort of stuff. And what happened is I was totally paranoid. I was burnt out. And somebody came along to me and gave me some tranquilizer tablets. Now, I took these tranquilizer tablets. I'd never had anything like it before. And suddenly, the world just went quiet on me. I felt like I was absolutely just removed from this planet. And you know, I was happy about it. I think I was so tired and so worn out with trying to be somebody, trying to make it, trying to fit in with this world around me. I was so worn out with it, I didn't care if I lived or died. And I started to take massive amounts of these tranquilizer tablets, along with the amphetamines, along with all of the pills, anything I could get my hands on. I mean, I was like a walking time bomb. I was also, because I had like real bad episodes of paranoia, and I'd already been introduced to a lot of gang violence and that sort of stuff. So I became a more violent, almost psychotic sort of person, you see. Now, I'd already said that this wasn't who I was meant to be. Deep inside, I still had that nagging voice that this isn't who you're meant to be. So, I'm going to fast forward a little bit and just say to you, you know, that the drugs went out of control, and I got involved with heroin and that sort of stuff. And, you know, I was injecting loads of heroin. I was taking anything I could get my hands on. I'd use pills, massive quantities of pills. I think I had something like 10 overdoses. You know, one real severe overdose, life support machine, that sort of stuff. Absolutely awful. And I was sick of it. I really was. I'd been in and out of jail a few times, you know, for doing some stuff like blowing cars up in the street and all sorts of stuff, you know. And I was sick of my life. I mean, I was 23 years old, I think, and I was absolutely burnt out, totally and utterly. One day, you know, somebody said to me, as they had been saying to me for years, why don't you get off the drugs, Mark? If you get off the drugs, clean your life up, everything will be okay. You know, I'd done this before, and it wasn't the answer. It just never really fit. And I'll tell you why. Because I sat there in this little flat, and I actually did this. I wanted to get my life together. I detoxed off the drugs, and I sat in a little flat on my own. And you know, from detoxing off drugs, the answer that everybody was saying to me, probation officers, all sorts of people, you know, they were saying that that would be the solution. From detoxing off of drugs, I found myself sitting in a little flat, all alone, with nobody. Absolutely nobody. And I'm there thinking, well, now what do I do with my life? I've got off the drugs. now what do I do? And suddenly, at that moment, there was a knock on the door. A friend of mine came round and he'd had an argument with his missus, and what he wanted to do is he wanted me to go out and score heroin for him. So, you see, obviously I'd just done a two-week detox off the heroin, so I wasn't completely right. I was still like really weak in myself and a bit sweaty and all that sort of stuff. And I didn't want to go and score heroin. I mean, you know, I wanted this thing to be over with. So what I did was, I said to him, I said, look, instead, why don't we go out and I'll buy you a few drinks and we'll go around and see my dad. My dad was a drug dealer as well. We'll score some weed off my dad. And what we'll do is we'll sit around there, we'll smoke some weed. And I'm thinking to myself, if I get the guy a few drinks, give him some weed, he's going to forget all about this heroin stuff, you know. But instead, what happened is, as he started to drink the pints, he started to get more aggressive with me, you see, because he wanted me to score heroin. Well, I didn't want any of it. So I say to him, I say, okay, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll go across the road to the off-licence. We'll buy a bottle of vodka. We'll go and see my dad. And when we do, you know, like, we'll get the weed. And I've got it in the back of my mind, like I say, that he's going to chill out. And I walk into the off-licence. So we go across to this off-licence. I walk into the off-licence. And as I walk into the off-licence, the girl behind the counter, she totally and utterly freaks out when she sees this guy with me. See, what had happened is 2 weeks before, the guy had tried to bottle the girl because he tried to rob the off-licence. She'd found him trying to rob the off-licence. And when she'd found him, he'd picked up a bottle and thrown it at her head. Now, I like this girl. I fancied the life out of her, to be honest. You know, so what I did was I turned around and said to the guy, I said, look, get outside, just go and wait outside. So he goes and waits outside, and I turn my back to the fella, and I turn to face the girl behind the off-licence counter, and I start talking to her again. And as I start talking to her, he comes running into the off-licence and suddenly explodes. He starts giving me all the names under the sun, he starts giving her all the names under the sun, and I just lost it totally. I grabbed hold of him, pushed him out of the off-licence, put him up against the window. I pulled a knife out of my pocket, put it to his face, and I said, listen, if you carry on one more time today, I'm going to stripe you. You see, and that means cut him across the face. And basically, I just had enough. It was a friend of mine. I thought to myself, is this, you know, have I sunk so low that my friends are going to have a go at me? But as I did this and I put this knife to his face, what he said to me was, go on, do it, and it'll come back on you 10 times as bad. You see? Okay, that's where the 10 times as bad comes from. So what happened was he sort of spun me out, and I put the knife back in my pocket. I thought, has he just said that? You see, because I was known. I had a reputation for hitting people with hammers and stuff like that, and I was known for it. So I was just caught off guard. Anyway, I can't remember the next few moments, but somehow I'd managed to go back into the off-licence, get the bottle of vodka, come out. We were waiting for my sister's boyfriend to pick us up and take me to my dad's house. So as I came out of the off-licence and my sister's boyfriend pulled up, what happened was I jumped in the back seat of the car. This friend of mine, jumped in the passenger seat, and my sister's boyfriend was driving. And he said to me, he says, look, before we go over to your dad's house, he says, we'll stop off at your sister's house. So I say, okay, no problem. Well, we'll just do that. So now we're pulled up outside my sister's house, which is just a few minutes away from the off-licence. I'm sitting in the back of the car, and this so-called friend of mine is sat in the passenger side. And suddenly I just thought to myself, did he just say that? Is it gone that bad that even my friends will walk all over me? I pulled the knife out of my pocket and I put him in an headlock and I cut him across the throat. And that's how I got the attempted murder charge and found myself suddenly facing a 5-year prison sentence. As I say, I got the attempted murder charge brought down to a Section 18 assault, and the judge gave me 5 years when I went up for the plea at Crown Court. I was thankful for it. It could have been a lot worse. I didn't start out, you know, for my life to be like that, you know, but here I was in prison, starting a 5-year prison sentence. Now, I look around me in prison and I think to myself, gosh, there's a million me's. All these guys, they're just like me. You know, all of these fellas, they're society's worst, you know, and they're all to blame. But you know what? each one of them, every single time I started to try and have a conversation with guys in jail about what life was about or why they were in, each one had a similar story to me, that all suffered a life of neglect or something like that, And I thought to myself, a lot of these guys, they've got nothing at all, nothing, no hope. All as they talk about all day long is crime. They're in jail for crime, and all they're talking about is crime. I thought to myself, I don't want this. I don't want this anymore. And that deep feeling where I said to myself, there's something more to life. I started to want to know what the answer to that was. So I started asking people questions like, what do you think life's about? And eventually, the question of God came up. What do you think God's about? Is there a God? And every now and again, I'd come across somebody that had a story that'd say, oh, I knew this guy, he was a drug dealer, he was a real bad guy, and he met Jesus. And whenever I heard something like that, I'd think to myself, what? Meet Jesus? You met Jesus? Like, how do you meet Jesus? And I'd really be curious. I'd want to know, how do you meet God? How do you do that? I mean, go to church? See, I don't know, but church, as nice as it seemed, it wasn't the place for me. It didn't feel like the place for me, I had better things to do on a Sunday. Well, not really, but it felt like I did. It wasn't the sort of place where a guy like me would fit in. I was after something more. You see, what I needed to do was know God. And when I heard those stories about people meeting God personally, I think to myself, that's it. That question inside, I know that meeting God is definitely the answer to that question that's been burning in me my whole life. So what I did was I started to ask people more and more. I started to get hungry and really hungry to know what the truth was behind all this God stuff. At the same time, I was in a Weimar prison. As Sean had just said to you before, I went over to Weimar prison, and the chaplain of Weimar prison was this big Canadian guy. And a friend of mine invited me over to go over to an Alpha course. And he also said to me, he said, there's tea and biscuits over there. Now, I didn't want to go for the tea and biscuits, but I tried to, I had bravado to keep. So I made out like I was going over there for the tea and biscuits, but I was actually going over there because I wanted to know more about this God character. When I went over to the chapels, I met this guy called SHAWN VERHEY. And he told me that if I was to ask God to come into my life personally, that God would come into my life. And we went into a little chapel, and he put his hand on me, and he laid hands on me, and he asked God, and he said, Jesus, I want you to come into Mark's life. From that moment on, I absolutely became determined that I really, really wanted Jesus to be the one who came into my life. So I started asking God, and the more I asked, the more I sort of ran out of steam, as it was. The more I sort of gave up on hope for this world, the more I gave up on hope for myself. And I started to ask more and more. Now, I'm not saying this was an instantaneous fix, because it was 18 months in between the time when Sean laid hands on me and what I would say I had an encounter, and I'll tell you about that. One night, 18 months later, I walked behind my cell door, and I said to my friend, Ricky, and Ricky had been in jail with me 5 times, maybe, and I would have these same conversations over and over again. What's life about? So I walked behind my prison cell door, and I said to Ricky, Ricky, why is it we're always talking about change, but change never happens? And he says to me, Mark, one day change will happen. And in that moment, I thought to myself, one day is an absolute lie. One day never comes. Why not now? If we want change, it has to come right now. So I turned around to Ricky and I said, Ricky, listen, never mind one day. What about right now? And he says, what do you mean? And I looked on the side and I saw a little Gideon Bible. There had been a little Gideon Bible placed in the prison cell. And I saw it, and instantly I thought to myself, you know what? The answer's Jesus. And I turned around to him and said, what about now? He says, what do you mean? I said, could you give your life to God? Could you give your life to Jesus? Could you give your life to Jesus right now? If a bag of heroin came under the door, could you take it and could you flush it down the toilet right now? Could you make the actual decision by doing something? Could you actually do something for God? Could you actually take him at his word? And I turned around, and Ricky just didn't know what to say. He must have thought I was going crazy. And I looked up to God. I guess I looked up at the ceiling, but I guess that's where I thought he was or something. But I looked up to the sky, to the ceiling, and I turn around and I say, Jesus, if you're real, I want you to come into my life. And you know something? I absolutely believe that you are the answer to everything. I want you to come into my life. I give you everything that I am, and I don't want what I want anymore. I want what you want. And as soon as I said that, I felt the presence, this beautiful, blinding presence, come down upon the top of my head to the bottom of my feet. It went through me like a wave. And each wave, each time, I felt this amazing presence go through me. I felt another sensation that I'd never felt before. I thought I knew what love was. Let me tell you, love to me was just sex. That was it. But when I felt the presence of God, I felt love for the first time. I felt a deep sensation that I'd never felt before. It was more beautiful, more blinding than any drug or any other thing that I'd ever taken or experienced. Any moment with a girl, any moment of success, anything at all. I felt this presence go through me over and over and over again. And with each sensation, I'd feel love, peace, joy. And then finally, the truth. Jesus Christ is the truth. Yes. I'd feel it so strong. It was amazing. And I suddenly started getting happy. I started laughing on my bed. I mean, I'm in prison doing a 5-year prison sentence, and I'm totally and utterly ecstatic about this amazing experience that I just had. I turned around to my friend Ricky and I said, Ricky, it's all true. Jesus is real. He's alive. You can meet him. He's fantastic. He'd say, Mark, what's happening to you? What's happening? I said, I don't know. It's just real. It's so wonderful. Well, I tell you, I started telling everybody about God. Absolutely everybody. And that's how I met Jesus Christ. This book, 10 times as bad, okay? The reason why we wrote it is because I'd read lots of stories about people finding God. Whilst I was on my search for God, I felt that, you know, these stories were true and they were good. But every time I get to the part where somebody would meet God in the same way that I would, every time I'd get to that part, I'd start noticing that the book had changed and a lot of Bible verses would take place of the stuff that I could really relate to. And I couldn't understand it, you know, Jesus, I am the bread of life. I didn't understand that. So what happened was, when it came time for me to write this book, I'd already been out of prison for quite some time. And I'd made a lot of mistakes. I mean, some real heavy mistakes. You know, it cost me a lot. And I don't think I'd ever read a book like that. I don't think I'd ever seen a book like that. I don't even think I'd ever heard of a book like that. I wanted to write a book that was absolutely, totally transparent, documenting a journey from someone like me, you know, from a background like mine, to where I am now in life. Documenting the journey, which is still ongoing. I'm a work in progress, the same as we all are, but the faults and the failures, absolutely, I wanted them recorded, because whilst I was in prison, I met a young man. He'd met Jesus, he'd had an experience, he'd had a conversion experience. He was 21 years old, and when he was 17 years old, he'd had a conversion experience. And you know what? He had absolutely fallen in love with God, and here he was back in prison. And I couldn't understand that at the time. And you see, the thing is all of this old stuff that he'd been used to in his life, all of this old rubbish that comes right up to the surface after you become a Christian, it had taken hold of him, and he'd made some mistakes, and he felt like he could never be forgiven again. And you know, I really needed to show people, because I mean, we're talking about 15 years down the line now. I'd made some terrible mistakes, and in making some terrible mistakes, I'd also found that God was very gracious, and that his hope never runs out, he's never failing, it never quits. He restores you, he gives you peace. So, as I say, we wanted this book to be brutally honest, transparent. We wanted a real clear and honest account of what it is to actually live your life with Jesus from a background like mine. So we released this book, 10 Times as Bad, in the hope that people who've experienced God and thought to themselves, you know, they can't be forgiven, or they can't be restored, or they've blown it too many times. What we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure absolutely 100% that there was something that restored people's hope. And in this book, there's hope time and time again. I mean, I have made more mistakes than you can possibly imagine, but there is a gracious and wonderful God who keeps on picking me up and picking me up and picking me up. He has taken me, and I am telling you, you know, the only books I've ever read about Jesus coming into people's lives like mine, you know, it seems to me like the guys go off and skip into a field with flowers in their hair or something. But that's not the case. You know, what happens is we have to work it out. And this story, I tell you, I implore you to read it for yourself, to pass it on to people who have got no hope. It's not just a book for Christians. It's not written like that in any way, shape or form. What we've done is we've tried to make this book applicable to everybody and anybody. Lots of people are reading it. I'm getting a lot more feedback from non-Christians than I am from Christians. Because, you see, people can relate to mistakes because we make them all the time. We're human. And, you know, God, He's the God of mercy. He's faithful. He's just. He's long-suffering. So, we've written the book. And on the back of writing the book, what I do is I wanted to make sure that we were able to provide some form of follow-up ministry for the book. So what we did is we formed a charity. It's called the Birch Tree Trust. If you go to your computer, www.birchtreetrust.co.uk, if you have a little look there, you'll scroll down, you'll see there's a few videos on there already, some nice stuff. You know, if you could just have a little moment, take and think and process what we're saying to you. We're saying that, you know, it's not as simple as getting people to become Christians and getting them into church on a Sunday. It's so much more than that. We need to be taking responsibility, and we need to be showing people that there's an honesty side to our mistakes that can benefit people. Instead of holding people captive with this image that we find God, and suddenly we're all superhumans and we're all okay. We want to do away with that. So www.birchtreetrust.co.uk. We're in this to try to provide hope, mainly to those people who've experienced the criminal justice system, like myself. But you know, to everybody. To everybody. We want to reach out to everybody.
That's
Is that right,
right,
Sean?
That's right.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you very much for listening.
God bless you.